Right, a quick disclaimer before we get to the fan fiction. This is my first project that I've done with a bunch of other people, well, two other people, and so it might not be the greatest in the world, well, my part at least, and you might hear some cars in the background, which I've tried to drown out as much as I could, but that's because I live right next to a motorway or a highway, so that's why. But other than that, I hope you enjoy the video, and yeah, goodbye. George looked to the bright burning fire, listening to the loud crackling noises that came with it. He then slowly looked to his friend Ryan. The poor guy had multiple burn marks on his body. Ryan had claimed they were old, but the burn marks were so severe that they looked fresh. He had some on his arms and one on the side of his neck. Ryan had also told George that there were a few burn marks on his legs and one large one on his back. George had read about how people that have experienced traumatic incidents will start to show signs of distress. Though he had never seen it in person, he had never met someone that had been through a certain experience. Maybe that was because it was made up. If something like that were to happen, they would probably linger on it for a day or two before completely forgetting it. George finally felt comfortable to ask Ryan the question he had held off for so long.
Hey Ryan, can I ask you a question?
George started, and Ryan looked up quickly after he was knocked out of his gaze, but giving a smile anyway.
Sure, what is it?
He asked, now focusing on George. George hesitated a little before saying,
How'd you get your burn marks? The ones on your arms, legs, and back.
Ryan slowly frowned and looked away, holding his own wrist.
Well, it's a long story.
Ryan started.
Back when Queen Mary ruled, I worked at a Protestant church.
Ryan let out hesitantly. George was now focusing intently on him.
A messenger had ran in and told me of an upcoming attack by the Catholics. It turns out they gave me the message late. They all burst in the church holding pitchforks and torches. Everyone in the church was killed. And I...
Ryan trailed off, starting to remember everything in vivid detail.
And I...
He repeated. He remembered the loud screams from his then alive friends. He remembered the feeling of his own skin cooking and the smell of his burnt flesh. He remembered the shouts of fury as he barely managed to escape with his life. He even started to remember the triggering events that didn't even happen that day. When Ryan got slashed by the sword. When Ryan felt his eyes burn and his throat hurt as he held back tears.
You're crazy, you know.
George laughed, and Ryan slowly looked up at him.
What?
Ryan stuttered.
I've heard a lot of crazy stories before, but not as crazy as this one.
He laughed again, but then gave a serious face.
I mean, back when Queen Mary ruled? That was over 100 years ago. I don't think you're over 100. I'll believe your story, mate. But I have to admit, it's pretty interesting.
Ryan's look changed to a mix between anger and madness.
So you think I'm crazy?
Ryan growled, and George moved back a little, becoming a little worried from Ryan's change of tone.
Jeez, you even look crazy now.
George let out.
You think I'm lying?
Ryan shouted, moving towards George.
Ryan, calm down.
He shouted as Ryan grasped George's wrists.
I've been through so much, and you think I'm just fucking crazy?
Ryan screamed. George saw Ryan's eyes shift to red.
Hey, let go of me. You're crazy. Are you even hearing yourself?
Ryan's scalera then shifted to green. He also started to cry, but they didn't seem like tears. They were dark purple, staining his face as they fell down.
You think I'm just crazy?
Ryan screamed at him. George wasn't able to reply, trying to get away from Ryan, but his grip was too tight.
Get the hell away from me!
George shouted desperately. Ryan then laughed manically and screamed.
You want to see crazy? You want to see fucking crazy?
George pulled back, still not being able to pull away from his grip.
Get off me, Ryan! I don't want anything to do with you!
Ryan's grip tightened even more on George's wrists, so much so his wrists started to bruise. Ryan then placed his foot on George's chest and pulled at his arm. George screamed as he felt his arm pop out of place, but then screamed with horror as he saw his arm get completely ripped off. The popping of the blood vessels almost deafening. Ryan's laughter was almost as loud as George's screaming. Ryan finally let go of George, instead holding onto the arm he had pulled off. George had tears of pain in his eyes, but he felt a sudden burst of adrenaline at that moment, and he quickly ran off, away from Ryan, ignoring the blood that spilled from his ripped arm. Ryan didn't give chase. Instead, he looked at the arm he had ripped from George, giggling as he took a large bite out of it, swallowing the raw human flesh. He got a few more bites out of the arm, before his eyes slowly faded back to their normal green colour, and his sclera becoming white again. The purple tears had now stopped, but the stains from the path they took were still there. Ryan looked at the arm he had ripped from George. He had taken 7 bites out of it. Human flesh. He had just eaten human flesh. Ryan looked around to see if George was still there, but he seemed to be long gone. Ryan did remember what happened, but he was not in control. It was something else. He then suddenly looked at the arm again, remembering he had ate 7 pieces of flesh from it. He quickly threw the arm to the ground. He felt like he was going to be sick. He still tasted the blood in his mouth, but the thought that he had just eaten human flesh was enough to make him throw up. And that's what he did. Ryan's stomach was almost empty as he threw up. Clutching his stomach, he fell to his knees, tears coming out and washing the stains of purple away from his face. That wasn't him. It wasn't his fault. Bluey had told him about a split personality he'd gained in his past life. Was that them? He couldn't just accept the fact that he went insane. That couldn't have happened. Not to mention the purple tears that stained his cheeks. Bluey had said that sometimes if a person had multiple personality disorder and they were reincarnated, the radiation of magic would sometimes make their eyes change. Ryan didn't see his eyes, but he saw the tears, as one of them had dripped onto the arm he had taken a bite out of. Ryan wiped the remaining blood away from his mouth, trying his best not to throw up again. George was a runaway, so he couldn't tell anyone about the accident because he would surely end up in prison. Unfortunately, this was the only good news Ryan had. Sure, George was a criminal and stole a lot, but he was still human. The guilt that Ryan felt was overwhelming, and he felt his hair start to go straight. He had caused too much pain to George, too much that he didn't deserve. Ryan saw his straight hair from the corner of his eyes. It was like it was never poofy before. He slowly stood up, wanting to tear his gaze away from the arm, but he couldn't. He slowly walked over and picked up the arm. With a sudden burst of anger to himself, he threw the arm into the fire. He sat back down, knowing he couldn't stay there for long, but he decided to wait till the remains of the arm burned before he left. Ryan began to think back to the time before he was reincarnated, when he was a king. He wasn't complaining that he was no longer a king in the second chance of life he was given, but he underestimated how hard it was to be poor. Ryan thought that making money would be easy, but he was wrong. He then started to think more, suddenly remembering the time he died and the pain that came with it. He had fell off a cliff, snapped his neck and cracked his head open. Either one would have killed him anyway, but he could remember the awful pain that only lasted a few seconds before his life slipped away. Ryan had read the history books about him. They said that he committed suicide, which was not true, but Ryan couldn't blame them. It was his own fault that he fell down, his fault that he ruined his own life. Just like before, Ryan remembered the time in the church, but this time he had time to think about everything without being spoken to. He felt everything flooding back to him, playing back in his mind over and over again, before Ryan finally gave in and cried openly, not bothering to stop himself anymore.